Hello and welcome to our next topic, or our next module really. This is module 2. So we've dealt with the rise of the Nazis and all these different factors that explain why Hitler was appointed Chancellor on January 30th, 1933. We now want to look at a much kind of shorter period really, just kind of 18 months. We're looking at the period from the February of 1933 through to the August of 1934, and we call this period the Nazi consolidation of power. So what I want to touch on here is what we're going to cover over the next kind of 3 lessons. We can kind of break down this Nazi consolidation of power period into 3 phases. Today's online class is going to focus at the legal revolution. The second class will focus on what we call Gleichschaltung, which really means the coordination of the new Nazi state. And the third example is what we call the defeat of the second revolution, where the Nazis, in this instance, basically resolve any problems that may come their way regarding internal opposition to the Nazi movement and to Hitler's position as Chancellor. Whereas what we're going to look at today, number 1, the legal revolution, we're going to look at Nazi attempts to remove any forms of external opposition. So we'll run through these 3 areas in 3 separate video lectures. We'll keep it nice and simple, and then once we have concluded these 3 topics, you have therefore completed your section on the Nazi consolidation of power. Okay, when Hitler is appointed Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, he has achieved what he'd always wanted to achieve. He was now the head of the German state. Would this give him the opportunity to put into practice many of his kind of ideological principles and kind of long-held views on what would make Germany a better place? I should say, I just said there, Hitler was now head of the German state. Technically that was still Hindenburg. Hitler was only Chancellor, and Hindenburg could still remove Hitler from office. But what we'll see during this consolidation period is that Hindenburg is not necessarily a threat to Hitler, partly because of his age, partly because of the momentum that the Nazis gain once Hitler has been appointed Chancellor. Now, Hitler may have liked to have started to think about his long-term aims, addressing the Treaty of Versailles, implementing the Lebensraum, tougher policies towards the Jews. But what he really has to do initially is focus on the things that were a priority for the German people, but also the priority for German elites. So for German elites, the priority was to dismantle Weimar, to get away with the this kind of social democratic system that had been in place since the end of World War I, remove that and replace it with something more authoritarian, something more akin to what elites were used to during the Kaiser's period in power. What elites would also like to see was not just an end to social democracy, but with it the end of the Socialist Party and the end of any communist threat. So that's a big part of what we're going to speak about in this lecture. What the German people wanted was prosperity, or even just stability, economic growth via jobs. They want the economy to pick up. So Hitler can't really ignore that element of the kind of demands that may have put him in power in the first place. He will get to number 1, right? He will get to the point where he realises, round about 1934, that the economy really has to be transformed. Something has to be done to get people back into work. That 6 million unemployed will have to disappear. But number 1 really does come after numbers 2 and 3. And that's what we're going to look at today. And part of what we're going to look at today is, did Hitler plan what we're going to examine between January 33 through to March 33? Did he plan in a kind of coordinated way to ensure that he would be dictator of Germany by March 1933? Or did he basically take advantage of circumstances that came his way? You can make your own mind up on this, but I will touch on that question of plan or just reaction as we run through today's examples. Now, I just want to kind of point this picture out to you. It's a very famous picture. It's a picture which shows us the Hitler cabinet for the very first time. This is January 30th, 1933. And this is the moment, I guess, that Hitler's dream of becoming Chancellor has come true. The reason I've circled three men in this picture, something I'm going to touch on again very quickly in a moment, is because these are the three Nazis that are part of Hitler's first cabinet, in an attempt to maybe demonstrate some level of kind of a kind of conservative, conciliatory approach. Hitler doesn't flood his first cabinet full of his own party members. He was not necessarily maybe allowed to do so, because remember, this individual who's sitting down here, Franz von Papen, is Vice Chancellor, and von Papen was kind of instrumental in ensuring that Hitler would get this post. So Hitler has to offer von Papen some concessions back. All of these individuals, you don't have to know who they are, right? Were mostly members of the DNVP, that's the German Nationalist People's Party. We're talking about the other right-wing political movement within Germany. And you've got the leader of the DNVP also in this picture. This is the man who actually helped Hitler with his campaigning during the kind of 1930s. That is Alfred Hugenberg. Hugenberg is the man who owned the cinemas within Germany and allowed Hitler to make full use of these. Hugenberg is actually, initially it would appear anyway, even more anti-democratic than Hitler. Hugenberg, again, we'll touch on in a second. The three individuals who have circled are obviously the Nazis: Hitler, Hermann Göring, who we'll look at his position in a moment, and then a Nazi that you might not have heard much of, Wilhelm Frick. Frick actually has a very important role in the early days of the Nazi regime, and he remains in post right until the very end. So this photograph opportunity was meant to suggest to the German people that nothing really has changed. This was not a Nazi seizure of power. This was not a new radical government. This was just another example of a fairly conservative government that is not purely Nazi based, but is a coalition cabinet. Now, we will have to touch a little bit more on the roles played by Göring and Frick in a moment. As I've said, today we are focusing on the legal revolution, and what we really mean by the legal revolution is Hitler and the Nazis had already attempted to seize power back in 1923 during the Beer Hall Putsch via what you might call extra parliamentary means, by the use of violence and force, and it was their intention to stage a coup and march to Berlin and overthrow the government. So those days are gone for Hitler. He wants to make it look like he has come to power legally. He wants to make that clear to the rest of the world. He wants to make that clear to German elites. He thinks that if he can do so, that might give him the opportunity to basically do as he pleases once he has established himself as the dictator of Germany, this new post, the Führer. Now, this would suggest that there's a bit of a plan in place, that Hitler has got a plan. In fact, it's not just that Hitler and the Nazis have got a plan. There are other elites like Hugenberg who would also like Hitler to have a plan, and that plan is to remove democracy, to remove the Reichstag as an effective body within Germany. If you cast your minds back to the class that we had right at the start of the discussion on the rise of the Nazis, which was the class on class antagonism, we know that elites had been gunning for democracy for a long time, so there was almost an expectation that Hitler would now follow through on his promises. Remember that Hitler is there partly because, yes, he has this mass support from the electorate, but he's also there because of his views, and his views are to the right. He's anti-communist and he's anti-democratic, and that therefore suggests that he's expected to implement some of the desires of the elites. And remember, the elites are maybe your landowners, maybe your industrialists, but also your bankers, financial class, and the military. So Hitler has got a priority, and as bullet point 2 suggests here, it was to eliminate the Reichstag as quickly as possible, but this was what Hitler wanted, by legal means. Now, if there was this idea that there was going to be a plan in place, we could argue that Hitler plays out this plan very, very cleverly, right? He's very astute in what he does. And one of the examples where you could argue that Hitler is astute is in one of the very first things that he does. This happens basically as soon as he is appointed Chancellor. I'm going to just click on source A for you to look at, which the second from last bullet point makes reference to. And here is source A here. It is a statement that Hitler makes to the German people on the day that he is appointed Chancellor, on the day after, sorry, he's been appointed Chancellor. And in this statement, he makes a number of points, right? I would argue there's kind of maybe 5 things that Hitler states that are of not just of interest, but are useful in terms of setting out or identifying what Hitler is setting out as being his methods and tactics that will give him the opportunity to basically remove democracy from Germany. If you take the view that Hitler was not just reacting to events, but they actually had a plan in place, and I think this speech is a good example of suggesting there was a plan because it's carefully worded. Hitler is trying to establish support from certain groups within Germany, and to do that he's identifying certain groups within Germany as being the enemy of the state, in the same way that Bismarck had done so in previous generations. Now, let's just very quickly read through this source, right, and we can stop and identify clear points as we go through it. Hitler begins by saying it's an appalling inheritance that we are taking over. Now, that's something that all politicians do. Take, for example, when Joe Biden makes his inauguration speech, he will say something very similar about Trump, and that's justified. I don't think Hitler is as justified, but I think what Hitler can say is, you've had years and years of economic crisis, you've had years and years of political instability, much of which the Nazis have created themselves, especially the violence that was taking place on the streets of Germany in the 1930s by the SA. Hitler can say, this is all the fault of Democrats, and I'm going to change that. Okay? So it's a fairly normal thing for a politician, I guess, to say when they come to power for the first time. He then says that he is facing the most difficult task a German statesman has ever faced. Technically that's true, right, if you look at the unemployment figures of 6 million. But here we start to see the first tactic of Hitler, and that is the idea of all Germans are in this together. And what he means by this, he says, we've got unbounded confidence that we believe in our nation and its eternal values. And then he lists the different groups who are going to be fundamental to this new Germany. Farmers, workers, the middle classes, they must unite, right, and he uses this term, and contribute the bricks wherewith to build the new Reich. So this is number one, class unity, i.e. inter-class unity. He is, to some extent, referring to an ideological principle that we touched on briefly in the past, but something we'll get to in more detail in future lessons, the principle of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. Class is no longer important, religion is no longer important, occupation is no longer important. What is important is that you're a German first and foremost. He then goes on and says this new government will regard its first and supreme task to be the unity of the people. It will preserve and defend the foundations on which the strength of our nation rests, and here's the second key point. It will take under its firm protection Christianity as the basis of our morality and the family as the nucleus of our nation. This is the appeal to Christians, especially to the Catholic Church and to Catholics, and maybe even to the Catholic Centre Party. Hitler is again suggesting he's not a radical, that he's a good Christian, and the Nazis are Christians, and this new cabinet are made up of conservative Christians. Hitler was not a Christian. Hitler did not really care about God at all. Hitler had no real interest at all in the family from a personal perspective. But he is saying the right thing here. Again, this does suggest that there's maybe some type of plan in place to target the Catholic Centre Party as potential allies. So that's point 2. He then goes on to say, standing above estates and classes, this new government will bring back to our people the consciousness of its racial and political unity and the obligations arising therefrom. Now, Hitler didn't really speak much about race, he didn't speak about anti-Semitism that often when he was speaking to the nation prior to 1933. He liked to minimise his anti-Semitism, which we know was, virulent, but he wanted to minimise it so as not to potentially upset or alienate elites within Germany who kind of found that type of chat distasteful. But he mentions for the first time race here as he's talking about this new nation. He then says it wishes to base the education of German youth on respect for our great past, and pride. So the kind of third point is really saying here, sorry, the fourth point, if you take the third point as being race, the fourth point is really making is that this new nation is going to educate the German people. It's going to be a nation which can take pride in its history, for example. And then the final point is key to understanding this entire 3-month period. Hitler's main enemy, if you like, even if they were not an actual enemy, the enemy that Hitler creates, that he hopes will put fear into the German people, is the enemy of the communists. And he argues that the communists, the political party, the KPD, are a threat to German stability. In fact, that there's even a potential opportunity for the Communist Party to stage some type of revolution, and Germany must defend its Christian values, it must defend the family, it must defend the nation from these Bolsheviks, who were linked more to Russia than they were to Germany. So Hitler says, this government will therefore declare merciless war on spiritual, political and cultural nihilism. That's just a way of saying the communists. Germany must not, and will not sink into communist anarchy. So the communists are going to be the bogeymen of this period, and it might be something which Hitler has thought of very clearly, that he knows will help him establish himself in this position of supreme leader of Germany. And he finishes with what appears to be a fairly, I guess you might say, kind of conservative statement, and maybe you could even argue justified statement, where he says to the German people, all I'm asking for is 4 years. You've gave these Democrats and socialists and these other losers, 13 years. I'm just asking for 4 years. And he says, then judges. Now, what Hitler means by 4 years is very different to the 4 years that other political parties would get. In fact, other political parties never get anywhere close to 4 years because coalition governments were constantly being replaced by other coalition governments. Hitler's asking for 4 years of dictatorship, 4 years where the Reichstag does not technically exist, and therefore other political parties do not technically exist. He is asking for an opportunity to kind of govern Germany in a way that I guess you could say would be totalitarian or authoritarian. So, the final bullet point says the statements on the above subjects undoubtedly won Hitler and the Nazis further support, primarily from the middle classes, maybe from other kind of Protestant groups, possibly from the Catholics. And he's kind of made it clear democracy has to go. He is not necessarily skirting around the question. He's asking for 4 years to make Germany great again, I guess is a way to think about it. So that's his kind of first approach, his aims. Let's focus more so on the tactics. Hitler was incredibly popular, right? We should bear that in mind. 37% had voted for him in July, 33% in November of 32. He still got a third of the electorate voting for him, so he is very popular. He can therefore expect that in a future election, right, which Hitler is keen on having, that he would do well on this. But he still has to take advantage of his newfound position to ensure success in a future election. So he takes advantage of the two figures I've mentioned, Frick and Göring, who the Nazis skillfully place into, I would say, the two roles within the cabinet that are going to give Hitler the best opportunity to control how events are going to play out in the coming months. Göring is the Prime Minister of Prussia and Wilhelm Frick is the Minister of the Interior. The Prime Minister of Prussia means that Göring was in charge of the largest police force in Germany, and Frick, as Minister of the Interior, was in charge of all remaining police forces within Germany, but also the individual who could make decisions about law. So Minister of the Interior is kind of the British equivalent of the Secretary of State, the person that deals with prisons and policing and law and order and so on. So these two areas are crucial to the Nazis being able to do as they kind of please. And what I mean by that is they can use violence, but they can say that this violence is legal and justified. There's I've called this source Z, right? There's a quotation here from Göring, right? So we know Göring is in charge of the Prussian police. This is a statement that he makes to the Prussian police on the 17th of February 1933. And what he basically says to the police is, he would be disappointed if they did not use violence against communists, against political enemies. So it's very difficult for these opponents, socialists and communists, in the period of February and March to really oppose the Nazis, whether it be oppose the Nazis through speeches, through newspapers, through parliamentary statements, or through taking to the streets to protest. It's very difficult to achieve that because the Nazis, via the state apparatus now, controlling the police, can use violence, but in inverted commas, legal violence, to ensure that there is no opposition. Now, whether or not the communists truly were a serious threat of opposition is still questionable, but the Nazis know that they can use the communists as this potential threat to bring on board more moderate sections of the population. So it's a tactic you get to actually, if you are a Nazi, possibly destroy the communist movement, which has always been your dream, kill some communists, imprison some communists, but at the same time you get the benefits of this, which is you look like the moderate, you look like you are trying to maintain law and order. So it's worth reading through all of this quotation in your own time. But as I said, the interesting aspect of it is the kind of part where Goering says, you know, I would prefer it if you did use weapons and use these weapons ruthlessly against the communists. So this is a new kind of direction that the German government is going in. I know the police always can be used as a form of opposition and violence, but now against protesters. But now we're kind of getting something that's a little bit different, a little bit more sinister. These are the police who are now basically being controlled by a political party rather than just the state. Now, on the 31st of January, the Communist Party had actually called for a general strike to oppose Hitler coming to power. So you can maybe see why the Nazis are responding in such a way. Maybe they do genuinely believe that the Communist Party are a threat. In response to this call for a general strike, Hitler and the Nazis pass via Article 48. So remember, Hindenburg can still issue Article 48 at this point. He issues the Decree for the Protection of the People, passed on the February 4th of 1933, and really this article, this decree, ensures that there can be no political meetings, no newspapers from political opponents on the left. So Socialist Party and the Communist Party are mostly affected by this Decree for the Protection of the People. Now what I think is important at this stage is that we are seeing Article 48 being used. The Reichstag has been suspended, right, because on the 31st of January Hitler has announced new elections, so these elections are going to take place in March. So in February, until the elections take place in March, Hitler is already basically ruling as a kind of mini dictator. Now, prior to Hitler being appointed Chancellor, he'd already had discussions and arguments with Hugenberg, who was part of the cabinet, about whether or not there should be elections. Hugenberg said, let's have no elections, let's just rule by decree and continue to rule by Article 48. If you don't know what Article 48 is, you may want to check back and have a look. But using Article 48 required the President to continually issue Article 48. Hitler does not want to rely upon Hindenburg rights. Remember, Hindenburg and Hugenberg, different people. Hindenburg is the President who can issue Article 48, but Hitler knows that that means that he is still required to ask for someone else's assistance and help for implementing or passing laws, and he wants that to end. He wants to make the decisions himself. To do this, he has to change the Constitution. To change the Constitution, you have to change Article 76, or you have to take advantage of Article 76 of the Constitution. Article 76 of the Constitution, very quickly, suggests that the Constitution can be amended. You might say this is another inherent flaw of the Weimar system. The Constitution can be amended, and the Constitution Hitler wants to be amended is going to say, let's basically do away with democracy for 4 years. So it's almost the Constitution shooting itself. This is almost as bad as Article 48, Article 76. But for a constitutional amendment to take place, 2/3 of the Reichstag have to vote on it. And that is really asking for these Reichstag deputies to basically shoot themselves, to give up on their own positions and posts and jobs. You're asking the people who make up the Reichstag to dissolve the Reichstag. So it might seem almost impossible for Article 76 to be passed, but we live in 1933 in a very different climate, and the German people are aware of the use of Article 48. They're not really aware of Article 76. It's not something which is necessarily in their kind of knowledge, right? It's not something which has been obviously spoken about before. But Hitler and the Nazis know that if they can use this 2/3 majority to get rid of democracy for 4 years, then they're on their way to establishing a dictatorship. The question is, how does Hitler get the 2/3 majority? Now, elections were going to take place on March 5th, 1933. So between February and March, Hitler gives Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, really the opportunity to do as he pleases, right? I.e. use as much propaganda, use whatever tactics, methods is required to get Hitler in these elections a 2/3 majority. You would think that the Nazis would win this election on March 5th easily because they've got the resources of the state at their disposal. Hitler is the most well-known individual in Germany at this point. They had support from elites as well. Just very quickly to go back to the sources. Here's source C. Hitler in February of 1933 addresses German industrialists, and he speaks to some of the most wealthy magnates in German society, and he plays the same tactic out once again. He says Marxism, i.e. communism, social democracy, is a threat to your success as a businessman, right? Your profits will be affected and continually be affected if we have this 6 million unemployed, if we allow the socialists back in, if we allow the communists to perhaps possibly stage some type of revolution. So what he's saying to the German industrialists is, don't worry, this will be the last election, and once the new regime is implemented, you can do as you please. We will not get in the way. And to some extent that is true. Okay, once war breaks out, the Nazis do demand that German industrialists prepare for that war. That's not as big a deal for industrialists because they're still making profit. Profit, as you know, for capitalists is their number one aim. So the kind of nature of Hitler's relationship with the industrial class is one in which they are going to be performing acts that are beneficial to each other. What I would say is, if you think about how the Nazis started off, they were the party of the small businessman. That is long gone, and here we get an example of why Hitler was not keen on sticking to any particular political manifesto, because he knew as time developed he would have to be pragmatic enough to exploit any circumstance that came his way. Here he is taking advantage of the fact that German industrialists, elites, are likely to be open to Hitler's ideas, and therefore he is going to give them what they want in the return for what they give him. What do they give him? Lots of money. What does Hitler do with this money? He gives it to Goebbels and says to Goebbels, let's make this the most effective political propaganda campaign ever. So this is the kind of context for the March the 5th, 1933 elections. The elites and the state are assisting the Nazis and are controlled by the Nazis. There is political violence being used against the communists, and there's also been Article 48 used against the communists and the Social Democrats. You would think this would be an easy victory at the elections. Well, there's one other bit of fortuitous event that will benefit Hitler and the Nazis. Just when you think everything is going their way, something else comes along and gives them that added boost. Now this here again takes us back to this question of, did Hitler and the Nazis plan the steps towards dictatorship, or did they basically take advantage of situations? Now, I would say that this is Hitler kind of just taking advantage of something that comes along his way. The Nazis have been accused in some quarters of starting the Reichstag fire on the 28th of February 1933. A law is implemented which might suggest, well, this law comes really quickly after the Reichstag fire. It all seems a little bit convenient, possibly. But anyway, the Nazis are technically, I would say, responding to events, because there was a Dutch communist found in the Reichstag with firelighters, and that individual was called Marianus van der Lubbe, and he's the kind of culprit. He's the person that is blamed, whether or not he was forced to do so, whether or not it was a communist plot, whether or not he was acting alone, whether or not it was a Nazi stitch-up, who knows. The point is, Hitler benefits from it. as the Reichstag is on fire, right, as you can see in this image, right, as it's in flames, Hitler and Goering turn up on the scene, and Hitler basically pretends that he is so upset that here is a symbol of German democracy being destroyed by communists. Hitler doesn't care about the Reichstag, right? He'd happily see it burnt to the ground. But it gives Hitler the opportunity to kind of feign shock and disgust. So, and Goering is told by Hitler to, go into action, do what you have to do, round these communists up, round the Communist Party up. These are democratically elected members of the German Parliament who are now going to be arrested. And Hitler, with Frick signs this off. The Decree for the Protection of the People and the State is an extension of the February 4th Decree for the Protection of the People. This is still an Article 48 decree. What is different about this article is it means that people can now be arrested and held without trial, and that remains in place, that principle, right through until 1945. It also means that people's civil liberties are attacked. If you were to look at the Weimar Constitution and to look at the kind of later on articles of it, really from about 110 onwards, the things that kind of guarantee people the right to assemble peacefully, the right to kind of maintain privacy in their home, that their mail should not be tampered with, all of these liberties are now restricted under this new Decree for the Protection of the People and the State. Sometimes historians refer to the 28th of February decree as the Reichstag Fire Decree, and maybe that's an easier way to separate it from the February 4th decree of the protection for the German people. Now, the communist deputies are, as I said, rounded up, sent to prison. Some of them are actually sent to a place just outside Berlin called Oranienburg. It's actually in Berlin now. It's one of the kind of regions of Berlin city. And this was an SA camp. It wasn't a concentration camp as we will become to know them, but it was a camp mainly for political prisoners. The SA controlled these in 1933 and 34, but later on in March, an actual proper concentration camp is built. It's Dachau, just outside Munich, one of the most famous ones, something we'll speak about again in future lessons. And these places are horrible kind of institutions, and they are really set up to brutalise socialists and communists and to possibly re-educate them, but that's highly unlikely. Although those who go to Dachau in 33 are let out later on, we'll come to that point later, but they're given a kind of an amnesty in the winter, Christmas time of 1933. The way that the Nazis are now governing Germany is very different than these other conservative governments that we had during the Weimar period. So the day prior to the election, on March the 5th, the communist deputies are arrested. And that's going to make it easier, you could say, for Hitler to maybe get his 2/3 majority in the Reichstag. He hasn't banned the Communist Party, I should make that clear. He didn't want to ban the Communist Party because he felt if he banned the Communist Party, communist voters would just vote socialist, and Hitler didn't want that. He wanted to keep the socialist and communist vote split. So, how does Hitler get on in this election? You would think it would be a shoe-in, right, based on all the factors and forces that have went his way. I just very quickly want to show you this cartoon. This is the Reichstag flag on the background. Here is Hitler being spoken to by Hindenburg. Hindenburg has handed him the scroll of emergency powers, and we know that he's been using them constantly. It's referred to, this cartoon, as a red peril, obviously a reference to the threat of communism. And here is Hindenburg saying to Hitler, "This is a heaven-sent opportunity, my lad," the Reichstag fire. "If you can't be a dictator now, you never will." So you're almost getting the suggestion that Hindenburg is wanting Hitler to take advantage of these circumstances. Now, that's not necessarily true that Hindenburg wanted Hitler to do this. Hindenburg kind of represents the elites in general. The elites, people like Hugenberg, people like the industrialists, the military. This is them now saying, here is your opportunity to not just become dictator, but to destroy democracy within Germany, which many of those on the political right had never truly accepted, as far back as the days of Bismarck, when the German Constitution was first implemented in 1871. Okay, on to the election then of March 5th, 1933. Here is the outcome. This is how German people voted under a climate of fear and intimidation and full-on Nazi propaganda. The Nazi Party get 44% of the vote. In spite, right, of as I said, of intimidation, the votes on the left, if you combine the Social Democrats or the Socialist vote with the Communist vote, it comes to 30%. It's remarkable, right? So a third of the country, a third of the electorate, has still voted for the political left in spite of all this violence and intimidation. This tells us something quite important. It tells us, first and foremost, that the Nazis never ever received a majority of the population voting for them, right? 44% is as high as Hitler ever gets. That tells us that 56% of the German people still reject Hitler and the Nazis in March 1933. It tells us that the Socialists and the Social Democrats and the Communist Party put their votes together, right? You get about 12 million people. It tells us that 12 million people, plus their families, people who can't vote, a sizable proportion of the population, maybe as much as 25 million people, really not just haven't voted for the Nazis, but really oppose Nazism and oppose fascism. And that is an interesting one. How are these people going to get on within the new Nazi state that is coming? What future do these people have? This is a real tough one for the Nazis. How do they deal with the working classes who have never, we know this from previous lessons, who have never voted for the Nazi Party? It's not as if all of a sudden Hitler becomes Chancellor in 1933 and he's dictator, or it's not that he just becomes dictator in 1933 and 1934 and everybody accepts that. Can you use political violence against 20 odd million people? Well, that's part of the story that we're going to have to continue to examine. What this tells us is that there's nowhere near a 2/3 vote for the Nazis. So the idea that they can change Article 76 in the Constitution is highly unlikely based on this vote. They need, as you would know, 67% of the vote. They don't have that, right? So they've got some way to go. But I do want you to look at the last two political parties on this chart, the Centre Party and the DNVP. If you add the DNVP vote, you get 52% to the Nazi vote. If you add the Centre Party vote, let's just call that 12%, you're up to 64%. You're much closer. And then you look at other parties being 6.5%. That includes other parties like the DVP, who are also kind of centre-right. It looks like Hitler probably could get his 2/3 majority vote in a Reichstag vote to eliminate the Reichstag if he could get the support of the Catholic Centre Party. Okay, what is it that the Nazis do? Well, they implement a new piece of legislation in March of 1933. They want, remember Hitler still was using Article 48 at this point, they want to, as the Enabling Act is called, or the Enabling Bill that becomes the Enabling Act is called, they want to pass a law for the removal of the distress of people and Reich. So Hitler's focus post-election is to convince enough members of the Reichstag to vote to change the constitution. And when they would do so, they would legally transfer legislative and executive powers to the Chancellor, i.e. to Hitler. Hitler would not have to rely upon Hindenburg. So we know they're far short of their 2/3 required. They are going to keep these Communist Party members. I mean, it's remarkable, right? 81 of them are still have still been elected, right, despite the fact they're in prison. He's going to keep them locked up, Nazis keep them in camps, just so it makes it easier for them to get their 2/3 vote. If you're not there to vote, then it makes it easier for Hitler, because what is 2/3 is reduced. So the focus is the Centre Party and the leadership of the Centre Party, Ludwig Kass. Now, if you think back to the very first statement, the first source we looked at today, Hitler has already thrown out some kind of appeals to the Catholics to think about him as a more kind of conservative, moderate, Christian, family-based leader, and his movement is not as radical as perhaps thought. So the Catholic Centre Party are just kind of, to some extent, caught up in all of the hype, caught up in all the action. They kind of jump on the Nazi bandwagon, i.e. the anti-communist Nazi bandwagon. Remember, Catholic Centre Party really despised the Communist Party for being so well, obviously atheist in their outlook. And, you know, there was no Catholic party in Russia, except Russia's not a Catholic nation. But the church had been, you know, targeted by the Bolsheviks in Russia. So the Catholic Centre Party are possibly brought around to this idea that voting Hitler into power for 4 years might be a sensible idea. And Hitler will do some deals with them initially. He'll say, we'll maintain your Catholic schools, you'll be able to keep your Catholic youth clubs, and also the Catholic Church will still be independent. So Hitler does throw them some bones, and the Catholic Centre Party have to decide whether or not they take them up. I just want to read another little quotation about what happens on the night of the law, the vote for the law of the Enabling Act. The Reichstag is obviously, you know, gone, it's been on fire, so the Reichstag has to move to a temporary home. That temporary home is the Crow Opera House. An SPD deputy, right, on the 23rd of March, the night the vote is taking place, describes the scene, right? You can read this in your own time on My City, but he just talks about the intimidating atmosphere that was present on that evening. He talks about the square in front of the Crow Opera House being crowded with masses of people, and these people were all pro-Nazi. They were shouting, you know, that they wanted the Enabling Act. There were Hitler Youth members with swastikas on their chests, looking at people, or looking at deputies who are going to vote, trying to block their way into the chamber, into the Crow Opera House. People having to run the gauntlet, being called Catholic Centre Pig or Marxist sow. The Opera House was crawling basically with the SA, right, who were lining the corridors and basically telling people, if you vote against Hitler, you'll pay the price. So we call this the legal revolution. There's a lot of illegality or immorality involved in Hitler getting to this point where he's trying to say, I did nothing wrong, I followed the Constitution. Yes, you followed the Constitution, but you used state-sanctioned violence, and you used the violence of your paramilitary organisation to make this happen. Plus, you received large amounts of money from wealthy businessmen. So the scene is set. The scene of intimidation and threats of violence in the dark of night, and the Enabling Act takes place, and the votes are as follows: 444 votes for Hitler, 94 against. So in spite of this intimidation, there are still 94 SPD deputies that turn up and vote against Hitler. The speech that Hitler makes a speech, right? Makes a short speech this evening why the Enabling Act has to pass, right? All the kind of rhetoric and it makes lots of kind of platitudes, right? Blah blah blah. Then Otto Wels, the leader of the Socialists, he stands up, right, and Wels says, very very bravely, right, he says, "We German Democrats pledge ourselves solemnly in this historic hour to the principle of humanity and justice, and of freedom and socialism. No Enabling Act can give you the power to destroy ideas which are eternal and indestructible." It's a very brave thing to vote, but also to stand up in front of a hostile crowd of deputies and make that statement in defence of socialism and freedom. Hitler was so disgusted by Wels that he goes back up to the podium and gets ripped into the Social Democrats. The kind of real sad aspect of this story is, if you ever go to the Reichstag in Berlin now, right, so it's a different building, but if you go there, it's a very famous building, you will see outside the Reichstag some stones, commemorative stones, listing all of the deputies that were killed, incarcerated in concentration camps and killed by the Nazis. The 94 who turned up that night, unless they left the country, which some of them were able to do, many of them died in Nazi concentration camps. Many of them, their names can be seen on this little set of stones outside of the Reichstag. So it wasn't just a matter of turning up and voting, it was a matter of turning up and voting with grave consequences. These Social Democrats, to be fair to the communists, they would have turned up if they hadn't been in prison, but these Social Democrats, the socialists, are the last real form of opposition to the Nazis. Communists and socialists are the most sincere forms of opposition to Nazism, and they keep, trying to oppose Nazism right up until the final moment. The wealthy, the middle classes, farmers, businessmen, religious groups, Catholics, Protestants, they all support Nazism, or they at least accept it, or they are too weak to oppose it. The Reichstag basically becomes a pointless body after this, right? It rubber stamps Nazi policies. Hindenburg's position as president was all that really stood in the way of Hitler, and he didn't even have to rely upon Hindenburg now for passing legislation, because Article 48 means nothing, that the constitution has now been changed. We'll get to Hitler's relationship with Hindenburg in a future lesson. But ultimately, the Enabling Act was of immense propaganda value. It maintained the facade of legality, even though it wasn't. Politicians, businessmen, church leaders maybe did not fully recognise Hitler's full intentions. Is that in any way something that we can say we would possibly argue as a defence of these people? I would say not, because other Germans, like the Socialist Party, knew what Hitler was about. They knew that democracy was not going to be returned. Do you think Hitler every 4 years was going to come back and say, let's have another Enabling Act? Well, he did, but it was just protocol, right? He was doing it really just to, again, carry on this facade that this was legal. The Reichstag is gone. The next thing to go will be political parties. And with other political parties, you don't have political opposition, therefore you do not need political institutions like the Reichstag. Final question to conclude. What were the reasons as to why the legal revolution was successful? Think about what I've just said, look at the material on My City, and try and draw up a very short list as to why you think this Enabling Act was ultimately passed in March of 1933. Thank you.